Gonzaga from Tenuta, San Leonardo, who I'm extremely happy to have with us today. Anselmo, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Eric, and lovely to be here with you to have a chat today. Really happy about it.
Well, I'm really happy to have you here as well. For everybody watching, this has actually been one of the Vinous Live episodes that has been in the planning since nearly the beginning. Anselmo and I have been talking about getting together and having this chat and sharing some of the interesting information about their winery and history and why it's so important. It's easily been 2 months that we've been talking about this, right?
Time flies, but it is.
Definitely. I
Absolutely.
mean, just to give everybody a little bit of an idea of why I think that Tenuta San Leonardo is so important and that the work of Anselmo and his father before him are doing. So Tenuta San Leonardo was first introduced to me going back maybe about a decade ago. And it was introduced to me through a retailer that I trusted that focused entirely on Italian wine. And they knew that, I was starting to explore. I wanted to understand, Brunello and Barolo and Super Tuscans. I wanted to understand all the big categories. And the way it was presented to me is that if you like Bordeaux or Bordeaux blends, if you want to understand Italy, you can't just stop at the Super Tuscans. You have to look to the Northeast. You have to look to the Bordeaux blends that are being made in the cooler climates and some of the amazing wines that are coming out of there. And it was also presented to me as a completely under the radar production of wine, in which it really was. And to this day remains an incredible value for what it actually represents. So here we're talking about wines coming from Trentino in the Northeast. We're talking about Bordeaux blends, but also we're talking about a history with this family that goes back so deep into the history of the region, but also connects to the history of the Super Tuscan movement. And there are all these are all facts I just want to bring to everybody's attention because this wine is as Italian as it can possibly be while still speaking to the international varieties that we all love. So after saying all of that, Anselmo, maybe you can tell us a little bit about Trentino. I also was really interested in how Trentino may differ a little bit because Trentino and Alto Adige, the differences between the two regions, and just tell
Absolutely.
us a little bit how things are out there these days.
Absolutely. Well, we are located, as you were saying, in Trentino, up in the northern eastern part of Italy. And sometimes one thinks that it's really far away. Instead, we are, to give you an idea, about 25 miles away from Verona. So really very close, behind the mountains which surround this property, and I will show you later. We have Valpolicella, which is maybe 10 miles right on air, how do you say, air length. Trentino is a region which came into Italy. It was Italian in the past, but then was under the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And then after World War II, it came back. After World War I, it came back to become Italian again. So it's very divided. This part of Trentino, the lowest part, is very Italian. It has always been. People were always speaking. While then, if you go up north, you can find the Alto Adige, which is the second province of the region Trentino Alto Adige, where it's German speaking, and definitely you feel another touch. You're more in Austria, I would say. Trentino is a fantastic region because it's covered in mountains. There are very few valleys. It's covered in grapes and apples. These are the main cultivations of this area. Unfortunately, and fortunately, Trentino land, there is a very small amount of private property in Trentino. The average is 1.2 hectares in this region. So this has generated an enormous amount of social sellers, which do a very decent job. And also socially, it's very important because it keeps the people tied to their own land. This is very beautiful because every village, people have a piece of land. So they live the rhythms of nature. They are attached to their plants. But then obviously they have to bring their grapes to the big social sellers. So unfortunately, this has not given the opportunity to privates to create larger companies, which in wine world often you need quite a dimension, let's say, to start because it's so expensive winemaking that you need quite an amount of land to make it.
Right.
It's a region very known for white wines, especially recently because of the Pinot Grigio phenomenon, let's say. But rather, there is more planted in red grapes. The autochthonous varieties of this region are very few, and the ones which are most famous are Teroldego in the northern part, so about 60 miles north from here, so very distant if you think in terms of terroir, and Marzemino, which is a classic Trentino variety, not very well known. In the white wines, we have very much Nosiola, but then more recently, now we have a lot of Chardonnay, obviously Pinot Grigio. Trentino is a great region for bubbles. If you are interested in a traditional Champenois method, the Champenois Trentino, the Trento d'Or is outstanding, I must say. It's a lovely region. You know, I'm in love with it, obviously. You know, it's my home. So I love mountains, and who loves skiing or hiking here? It's a paradise.
I can only imagine from some of the pictures that I've seen that you've sent. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. But you know, so the image that I have up here right now really does show exactly what you're talking about, just how close that you are to Verona, and so you're in the most southern tip of Trentino here.
Yes.
And exactly you're saying how Trentino more Italian, where Alto Adige more, you know, from the Austro-Hungarian influence.
Tradition, yes, absolutely, completely.
And for me, you know, outside of Tenuta San Leonardo, you know, it's funny because for me, Tenuta San Leonardo, before really understanding the geography, I didn't really think of it as a wine from Trentino because it just really kind of, it has its own, very much the same way that Sassicaia has become its own entity within the Tuscan coast. San Leonardo has kind of become its own entity up there. I mean, you do have some other pretty famous red wine producers there. Foradori comes to mind.
Absolutely, wonderful producer.
I mean, there are certainly many others. And I'm really interested to start really tasting through the rest of your range. But the wine that really brought me to you was the Grand Vin of the house, the Tenuta San Leonardo. So
you are right.
When it comes
but it was very interesting what you said, you know, that, and this has always been, I think it's a nice hint to give to the people. It has always been so difficult, especially for my father in those days, to bring to the attention of the people something that was such an outsider, you know. Bordeaux blends are very present in the northern eastern part of Italy, but definitely to make them become your unique road is something difficult, not only on the production side, but especially in the communication side. You know, I mean, it was very hard in those days to promote the wine.
Well, what I also think is very interesting, and Masha, before I say this, let me just mention anybody that's viewing this, if you'd like to ask any questions, send them to me early so I can really weave them into the conversation. But I certainly have a lot of stuff that I want to talk to Anselmo about, but if anybody else has any questions, please do send them in. But as I was saying, what I really always found so interesting about San Leonardo is that when I think about the Bordeaux that I love, I think about, you know, Bordeaux from 40 or 50 years ago. You know, I mean, it definitely is, you know, there's certain vintages that I really love that are more current vintages, but the bigger that Bordeaux got and the more reliant they were on, you know, making the wines, I know some people are going to probably be upset when I say this, but more, you know, New World in style to a certain degree. The less I found myself gravitating toward new vintages of Bordeaux, but the more that I would think of Tenuta San Leonardo, and I would think about San Leonardo as a wine that when I open it, I mean, it's almost like I'm experiencing a throwback Bordeaux. Do you know what I mean?
Thank you. I mean, that's the best compliment. That's the best compliment you can make to my father, to his creation, because that was his objective. And San Leonardo, we've always done Bordeaux blend since the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. But it was thanks also to Mario Encisa della Rocchetta, who was the enological godfather of my father, who gave him this passion for the tradition of Bordeaux, the elegance, the freshness, the delicacy, wines that could age but could evolve and were drinkable, which is something that I always say to people. And it's not a beautiful word to put on great wines, but to me, it describes that ability of the glass calling you, rather to have to remember to take the glass in your hand, let's say.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely, absolutely, and that's the thing. These wines are so wonderfully aromatic. I mean, they're absolutely stunning aromatically, but then on the palate, you know, when you have all of these, you know, beautiful, like, you know, peppery florals and herbs and bright fruit, then on the palate for it to be so soft and enveloping. I mean, that's what I absolutely love. But I'm getting off topic here, because I really do want to talk a little bit about that history that you brought up. So if people don't already know this, the history of the actual location, Tenuta San Leonardo, actually goes back 1,000 years ago, when it was originally farmed by friars, by a religious order, correct?
Absolutely. This was erected as a little temple, un capitello, as we say in Italian. So a place where you could hold the image of a Mary or a Jesus Christ by a group of prisoners who were coming back from France. And when they finally got freedom here in Italy, they made this capitello to thank San Leonardo Noblat, which was a French saint who is the protector of the prisoners and is still today our saint patron. We have a church inside of the estate. We still celebrate the day of San Leonardo with a beautiful, first mass, and then we drink till the night becomes day, let's say. So it's really a long history, and the church then sent a group of monks here around the year 1000, building the church, and then the monastery surrounding the church, and then obviously the fields, because the monks had to have wine, they had herbs, they had honey with the beekeeping. I mean, the church has always been responsible for the evolution of these cultures, of these sciences, I would say, because they had the time, the culture, the capacity also of dedicating their time to this. So it's true. It's a very long story backwards. And then my family arrived here around the 1730, 1740. And they fell in love. They were called in by the church to manage the estate, but then they fell in love, and they tried so many times to buy the estate of the church, which would not sell them the property. And they finally bought it exactly 250 years ago. So on the 5th of December of the 1770. And this year we are going to celebrate on the 5th of December 250 years from our acquisition. So it's an important year for us as well.
That's absolutely amazing to think about such a history going that far back. But now, so the more modern day San Leonardo, though, that was really due to your father, who had
absolutely
a tremendous interest in wine, who was coming from a family that was already vine growers and winemakers, but it was more traditional Trentino varietals at the time, or what kind of wines were they making in those days?
Well, to tell you the truth, the first real wine lover of the family was my great-great-grandfather, who around the 1870s, more or less, had collected a lot of vines, of plants, of vineyards from the whole of Europe. So he had brought in Riesling grapes, he had brought in probably Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, we don't know because we have never found these. And the Cabernet, which then revealed to be the Carmenere, which is the soul, I would say, behind all our wines, but we will talk about it later. And we found recently the diary of his sister. So, and the sister was selling that her brother was always in the cellar. He had fallen in love with winemaking, and that the wines, at least this is what she states, were sublime. So we're very happy about this. But then,
sounds
the Merlot arrived here around the 1920s, but this was the whole of the region. I mean, the importation of Merlot comes back to those days. And in fact, we had bottles of we have labels of those days, which have already international varieties. So here it has always been in the DNA of the estate, in the recent DNA of the estate, these international varieties. The story of my father is nice. I mean, my father was born in 1938. He's still well and alive, luckily for all of us. And he is a bomb of energy still today, I must say. Very passionate gentleman. He hated studying. And so my grandfather, who was very strict, my grandfather was from 1895. So it's like a great grandfather for me. I never met him, in fact. He got my father at 10 years old to go in Switzerland in boarding school because he was not happy at all of there he is here. He's around 35, 40 years old already. But he went to Switzerland to study in boarding school very young. And then when he finished boarding school, my grandfather just told him, now you're going to study enology, winemaking. And it was not an advice, absolutely. It was a direction, very clear. There was no, there, there was not any possibility of with my grandfather. And, my father really found, and this was quite anomalous, Eric, because in those days, and this I say it in no snobbish way, but these families were still very old in the 50s, I mean, it was still another world. And so the careers were more like law school, diplomacy, politics, maybe medical school. Winemaking school was completely bizarre,
Right.
at that time. But
So
he
was
was
the
my
idea to
grandfather.
carry on the family tradition of winemaking?
Yes, but I think that my grandfather was very passionate, and he thought it was something innovative. My grandfather was not, was not so old in the mind. He was very always looking to the future, and this was great, And my father immediately found himself. He found his passion, And there is a picture that I sent you of my father in the enology school with the glass in his hand, and he's like
Yes.
18 years old or 19.
Yes.
And
No, I saw it. It's amazing.
he came out of that school after 3 years. It was a Swiss school with a French background. So imagine that was very modern for the time. I mean, Italy was backwards still
Hmm.
in most of the country in the 50s. He was studying yeasts and malolactic fermentation, secondary fermentation, which was something of which nobody was talking still in Italy. This was the school of Émile Peynaud, the famous French enologist, which changed radically the winemaking technique of the French. And when my father finally graduated, he was thinking that he would have come back to San Leonardo finally, get and work for his company. But my grandfather made him another wonderful surprise because, and he had hired a winemaker just 1 week before,
Oh
and the
my.
winemaker was 1 year young, 1 month younger than my father. So not even to say, he was full of experience. It was
Right.
really clear that my grandfather
Okay,
didn't
well,
want him
this
by his
brings up
side.
a really good part of your history too. So he comes home and
Absolutely.
there's an enologist already working with your grandfather, and so he ends up going to work with
In Tuscany.
in Tuscany at
First
Sassicaia.
consult at Sassicaia after, but first he did consulting in many different estates, and then he ended up to the property of the Marchese Mario Incisa, who
Hmm.
was one of the best friends of my grandfather, and he was experimenting on these new varieties, new for Bolgheri, because the Cabernet was absolutely introduced by him in
Right.
Bolgheri. And but when my father arrived, there were maybe 2-3 hectares in total. Huh? I mean,
Right.
we're talking a really small piece of land yet
Yeah.
to be cultivated. And my father really was amazed by this gentleman who was so smart, so cultivated, who had all these beautiful relationships with all the chateaux of Bordeaux. Because now today they are all of properties of luxury brands or banks or insurance
Absolutely.
companies. But at the time, there were families behind it with great passion behind it, and they were writing to each other, how to make these wines. And I thought that this was very, it's very beautiful when you find a family. Nothing wrong.
Absolutely.
There are people who give all their life and all their heart in making wine. I'm not saying that, but the history of a family when you tie it to the land is always fascinating to me, at least. And there, my father learned the passion for Bordeaux because the Marchese Incisa every evening would open for my father a great bottle, and these were not as expensive as they are today. It's not a
Right.
question of value, but the question was the difficulty of finding these bottles. It's not that you could walk in any wine shop and find a Chateau Mouton
Right.
or more even a Latour, which was more like famous at that time, maybe, and it wasn't so obvious, and people didn't know what to expect as well inside of these wines. And this is where my father gathered his passion. This is why I call the Marchese Incisa the enological godfather of my father, because he is the one who gave him that drop of passion that really drove my father back here in San Leonardo to follow that road with one single dream, a real vision at that time.
And the amazing thing too is, a lot of people don't even realize this, but you go back into the history of Sassicaia, it wasn't like an immediate sensation. It's not like Sassicaia just suddenly became, popular and world renowned. It took a great deal of vintages that were maturing in the
Absolutely.
cellar to finally for the world to start to understand that they were onto something great there at the Tuscan coast. So your father was there at a time when it really was a passion driven work of love.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is still today because Sassicaia is still a company run extremely well by a lovely family. We're still very close with the Incisa, and I personally love Sassicaia very much still because it has kept that style, that uniqueness, that identity, which I like to find in wines. It's still a wine that gives me an emotion. Also because it is the history of Italy, of the Renaissance of Italy, let's say, in the wine world. And definitely, I mean, this crossing of these two names for passionate people is quite clear. But my father always asks me to be very clear in saying that he was not the creator of the Sassicaia in no way, because that was the Marchese in cheese, and then it was perfectionated by Giacomo Takis. But
Right.
he was working there on the pre-wines, let's say, not on the Sassicaia. So that was not his his gift, to that company. Absolutely.
Still an amazing experience to be sure. And also
I'm
interesting
sure, yeah.
because the terroir between the Tuscan coast and Trentino is so vastly different. So
Completely a world.
it's amazing to think.
Absolutely.
So then he comes
Absolutely.
back, unfortunately, due to the loss of your grandfather, he comes back
Yes.
to
He comes
Trentino.
back maybe 2 years before because my grandfather was aging, and he understood that it was time that he started leaving my father. He knew my father had become a pro and had dreams, and my father is stubborn, somebody passionate and strong as well. And then my grandfather passed away in 74. And in 78, my father plants the Cabernet Sauvignon. Actually, this was the first vine he planted where I am of Cabernet Sauvignon. And then in 1982, he does this perfect harvest. And then he decides to give it a go, and to create the wine that he had in his mind, his dream wine. And this was we had a wine called San Leonardo since the 50s already, and it was a uvaggio. And uh, this word is something that sometimes it confuses people. But what I intend by uvaggio is when you put different grapes to ferment together. It was typical in the old days, and you would put maybe Cabernet and Merlot, which were ripening at different times, but no, the harvest was just you start and you go and you harvest all the land you have. It wasn't so precise as it is today, where we try to always reach the perfection, not one day more, not one day less. And so they would put to ferment all the grapes together, and they would get wines which were not very well composed. And my father that year decided to separate every single variety from each field and ferment it separately and independently in order to get the character. And that was also the first year he started using the barriques, which is another subject, that has brought a lot of people to love and hate wine or the barrels itself. But on this kind of of grapes, I mean, the barrique is just designed by God, I think. I mean, it's just the perfection. And
Right.
we've
But you
tried other
don't hear
things.
that
I mean,
conversation so often when you think about Bordeaux. That's for sure. You don't. I mean, at least I don't hear about a lot of people asking why estates in Bordeaux are using barriques.
absolutely. No, this is totally Italian. You're absolutely right, Eric. Totally Italian. This fight inside that we came out between the end of the 90s and the beginning of 2000s. This great, let's say, groups of people really shouting to each other, pro and against the barriques. But this is Italian history. And I mean, we have this very simple cellar. It's still exactly the same. It's all concrete, very small vats, and we are still not using any vintage with selected yeast. It's still all indigenous yeast that you find on the grapes, and this is
That's
because of the climate. I mean, this is it's not a question of being better or worse. Um, it's not that, it's not a question of better or worse. It's really a question of uh, being able to do it, and we are able here. I mean, there is the freshness keeps the colonies of the yeast alive, you know, and this gives us the opportunity. We have no cooling, no heating in the vats. We don't use selected yeast, no filtering. I mean, this is a very, allow me the term, natural wine in the
Absolutely.
way a lot of people think about it, you know.
Also, all organic.
Yes, now we are fully organic.
Hmm.
Let me move just in front because there is very little light, so I just move a little bit because if not, you cannot see me anymore here. We are fully organic now. We have transformed the estate in 2015. We have converted. It was a hard moment, but we had already taken away all herbicides 10 years before with mechanization. So
Hmm.
that is the big difficulty. And then changing has been, for me, one of the most fascinating times of my life because I might have a degree in economics. So I mean, I love nature. I came here for the love of the fields and of the animals. This is what really interested me, even more than winemaking when I was young. You know, when you're 18, yeah, you may love wine because you drink it, but maybe you're not so much into this
Right.
philosophy, you know. But my drive was very much the nature side in San Leonardo. But when we transformed the vines, I mean, the living soil was the most fascinating part of it. Understanding the balance, because you know, my father made a great achievement in changing technique in the cellars, and this was the birth, the rebirth of San Leonardo.
Hmm.
Then in the year 2002, we decided to focus on the vines, trying to make them age longer. And we changed all the pruning system. It was a wonderful time. We spent 3 years with Simone Tansirk, you know, the two Italians who invented this beautiful system of, of pruning the vines. And that was fascinating. But now it's the central part is the soil. We use also some of the biodynamic methods. I have nothing against biodynamic. Actually, I'm fascinated by it, but a part is a bit philosophical to our aspect, let's say. And we love very much, we use the moon, We do nothing without the help of the moon here. We're very careful because that is science. I mean, we're not talking of philosophy. We're talking of something which is so powerful on our lives, you know, and this is very important.
Well, speaking about vineyards and about the varieties and the work that your father did when he first came back, replanting and such.
Yeah.
So, you know, what I mean, he also changed the entire training system at the time, correct?
Totally. I mean, we had only pergola at that time, of
Hmm.
which we still maintain quite a large amount of pergola. And it's, I would say, it's one of the secrets, allow me term, to keep alcohol levels low and keep the freshness. So we integrate 1/3 of pergola and 2/3 of uh, bouillon for the Carmenere and spur cordon for the Cabernet. And this was introduced by my father, so it was very innovative for that time. And this is also part of the revolution that really helped, you know, San Leonardo gain a little bit of structure. Today we are in a warmer climate; it is easier. But back then, 38 years ago,
Hmm.
it was much more difficult because, first of all, ripening time was, you know, later, and the cold would come earlier and would not allow the level of the sugars to rise enough. And we were doing wines at 11 and a half degrees, and they needed more shoulder. And so this was why my father planted Guyot and Spur Cordon. And that really changed radically the structure of the wine beneath it. But still today, you know, we have all our wines at 13 degrees, you know, 12 and a half, 13, maximum 13 and
Right.
a half in very rare vintages.
I mean, it's pretty amazing actually when you look at a bottle of San Leonardo. So I actually do have I have a bottle of the first vintage produced by your father at San Leonardo here. 12% alcohol, by the way.
And
Absolutely.
probably, Eric, that probably was 11.6, 11.7, and they wrote 12 to give it, you know, importance, to be more important than what they thought, you know?
And this is, I mean, this is a bottle that, I mean, it's still alive, you know, and this is what people really need to understand about these wines is that they, you know, these are not just 10 or 20 year wines. These are 30, 40, 50-year wines, if not more.
Who knows?
Always, yeah,
Absolutely. And
absolutely. You know, which reminds
that
me,
is not a, it's not an ability of the wine making also, but this is the ability of the terroir.
right.
And as my father always says, wine is made in the countryside. In the cellar, if you're stupid, you're going to make it worse. These are his words all the time, you know.
Well, and that's something, it's a very modern term we hear these days, is that wine is made in the vineyard, you know? It's
Absolutely.
really funny, when going into this conversation, I completely forgot that I had opened a bottle of the 2014 to share while we chatted today.
Let me take mine. Let me take mine. It's just here.
And the great thing
So,
about this is that even though here this is currently 12 o'clock in the afternoon, the rest of this bottle will only be better tonight with dinner.
thank you. That's kind to say.
Now, it's certainly one thing that I do love about the 14 is that we were just talking about the amount of time that these wines can mature in the cellar. One of the things I love about the 14 is that there is certainly a little bit of early accessibility about it. It's not like you don't taste it and feel like, oh, I made a mistake. I opened this way too young. But in the same token, to everybody watching, one thing I love about Tenuta San Leonardo is that even in those warmer, riper vintages, like I would think like 2000 would be a good example, these wines still mature beautifully. They may not end up being quite the classic wine that a cool climate, a cool classic vintage might be, but they still mature beautifully.
This
Cheers.
is the ability of the mountain. Cheers, Eric. Cheers. This is the ability of the mountains. When we talk about San Leonardo, we talk of the mountains. It could not be the way it is without, let me show, because if not, the people do not realize where we are, these are the mountains that surround us. It's all mountains. We are in a sort of canyon, we're not even in a valley here. Sorry, it's a bit wobbly.
No, don't worry about it.
This is the ability and the freshness, the minerals probably, and the cold air during the evening, the warm air during the day, the wind. Italy is a beautiful country, and each part has a microclimate because it's a very small and vast country in terms of orographic. But here there is a great, I would say, a great place where to grow these kind of varieties. And you see, yes, we have snow in the winter. Actually, we pray for snow in the winter. There is a saying here in the countryside that we say, under the snow bread, over the snow hunger, because the snow is so important in the winter because it disinfects the soil. It kills a lot of bugs that you don't want, or viruses or things like that. And it keeps the soil warmer than 0 degrees and moist. So that is the perfection. When we have lots of snow, we're happy.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely stunning just looking at these photos and such. It's just, you get lost in it. You had mentioned hiking and things like that. I can imagine coming up there and spending a good amount of time just like in
yeah.
I can't even imagine what it must be like to live out there.
This mountain just besides me, it's called the Garden of Europe. And this holds 60% of all the flora you find on the whole Alps of Europe on one single mountain, thanks to the Lake of Garda, which is on the other side of the mountain, which heats up the air every single day with a wind, which blows also here at 2 o'clock. And so it protected a lot of flowers from glaciation, and they survived. And so, it's a place there is so much life in this soil. It's beautiful.
Well, one of the things I also wanted to touch on before we kind of separate from the vineyards a little bit is the initial listing of Cabernet Franc on San Leonardo for what 20? Wait, which was the first vintage that was no longer listed? Do you know?
The first no, 1982 was the first vintage where it's written Cabernet Franc. And instead it was already Carmenere. And the last one, I think it's 2010, Right,
2010. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
It's a really, really, I think it's a really cool story about that. So initially, everyone thought that they were actually Cabernet Franc. It was planted. Was it planted with that in mind, or was it something that was kind of lost in antiquity?
No, I think it was really a lack of culture, first of all, Eric, because and a lack of ampelographic culture. So this probably reached San Leonardo, the Carmenere, in the late 1800s, thanks to my great-great-grandfather, as I told you. And then a lot of northern eastern parts of Italy received Carmenere after the phylloxera.
Mm-hmm.
In Bordeaux, it has never been replanted, or it's planted in less than 1% of the whole soil. I mean, it's really rare to find a chateau which has Carmenere because it's a very difficult grape to grow. And if it's cold, you lose a lot of the crop, and it's very low yields. And obviously, the French have also business in mind. I mean, when I talk about wine, I talk also of the business side, not because of it's my interest, but because without money you cannot make your dreams come true. Well, you cannot invest, and this is a very long work. You need decades to make your dreams come true. And here it was planted and called Cabernet Franc, simply first Cabernet and then Cabernet Franc, because, and this is my personal point of view, but I've discussed this with a lot of people, when you produce 300 quintals per hectare of a grape, like Carmenere or Cabernet Franc, they tend to resemble each other. They become very green, very harsh.
Mm-hmm.
They're poor in fruitiness. And so people probably just by knowing the name Cabernet Franc thought that was it,
Right.
And my father was convinced of that until the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s even. And he discovered this when he bought a new batch of plants from Bordeaux, because he bought a lot of plants from Bordeaux in those days, in the 80s and the 90s, from a very famous pipinarist, the gentleman who makes the wine, who makes the Pinot Noir for Romanée Conti, to give you an idea. He's really somebody passionate and very smart. And he sent some new Cabernet Franc, because my father had taken out one vine of Cabernet, what he thought was Cabernet Franc, and replanted it. And all of a sudden, after 2 years, he understood that there was something wrong. I mean, Cabernet Franc has a small berry like this. Carmenere has a cherry instead of a berry. And it's completely different. And my father phoned him and he said, I mean, Pierre-Marie, here, there's something wrong. You sold me something wrong. And so he came down. And then with Attilio Scienza, which is a famous professor of Italian viticulture, they said, but Carlo, what you have here is not Cabernet Franc. This is Carmenere. It's very rare. It's very, nobody grows it anymore because it's difficult. And we were coming out of 100 years nearly of experience on this grape. And so my father, this struck him. I mean, he understood he had something unique, but he never wrote it on the labels for two reasons. One, it was not allowed to have this grape. It
Right.
was not in the list of the of the grapes that were allowed to be grown in the region until 2010. And a lot of people had it. Trust me, it was explanted. 99% of it has been explanted, but there were lots of people who had it. And then the second reason was that Carmenere. Imagine in the 80s in Italy, where we were still in most restaurants talking about red and white, and that's it. You
Totally.
write Carmenere. I mean, who would have bought that wine? I mean, my father always tells me, it seemed in those days, it seemed more like a bad word than a grape name.
Well, I was so happy to actually see this for the first time, because this is an example of just how proud that you are of your Cabernet. And I always see it as it was basically the secret ingredient of San Leonardo. It's
exactly the same words I use, Eric. Absolutely. And my father says this is the grape that gives the soul to our wines, because it's a typical expression in the cuisine, I would say, of maybe 50 years ago that my father heard. And this is inside of him. He goes, questo è il sale di San Leonardo. He always says that.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. So really,
I'm sorry. That bottle of Carmenere was made by me and the director, Luigino Tinelli, who grew up with my father secretly. Because when I came into the estate, my father hated that I wanted to make some new wines. You know, you imagine a guy of 22 years old, 23, you're full of energy, you want to change things, you want to add things, you want to express yourself, you know?
Right.
And in 2007, we had a lovely harvest. We had tons of Carmenere that was not using for the San Leonardo. So I said to my father, we could make a Carmenere, pure Carmenere. He said, no way, we're not going to make new wines in here. So I called the director, was there with me after the meeting. He said, don't worry, Anselmo, you don't have to act this way with your dad. You don't have to go straight forward. Let's bottle it secretly.
Right.
And then we show him in some years. And so I bought I bought personally the glass bottle because I did not want to show them on the registry of the purchases. I bought them with my own money, and we bottled 1,724 magnums, which was quite a bit. You know, I mean, it's not 10 bottles. And we showed my father maybe 5 or 6 years later. And then he said, "Oh, wow, this wine, where did you find this wine? This tastes just like our Carmenere." I said, "This is our Carmenere."
Hilarious.
And then he said, "Okay, you have my permission. Go for it. Now it's your time."
They
And
say
it's
sometimes it's easier to apologize than ask permission, right?
Yes.
Like make a mistake and apologize versus ask permission.
Here we say it's better to be red than pale.
There you go. That's great. So I'm interested because of the fact that you guys have this tremendous cellar of vintages, which obviously goes all the way back to 1982. Is
Yes.
that something that your father started, or was your family doing that before? And how much do you keep back?
No, that is my father. That is my father because you know that Giacomo Takis has been consulting for my father since 1985. That was I would say one of these other turning points of San Leonardo when my father decided to take on. And Takis told him, put 1,000 bottles or 800 bottles aside every vintage. And my father said, "Oh, that's too much wine. We need to sell it." You know, he had very little money at that time. So the idea of putting 1,000 bottles on those days when he was producing 20,000 bottles was enormous. So he put on the side 200 or 300 bottles. But then when I came in the estate and we had a lot of difficulty in selling the wines because people wanted more riper wines in the beginning of the 2000s. They wanted wines which were slightly more built and slightly more modern, let's say. I understood that in those days people were always saying how beautiful the old wines of San Leonardo were. So I told my father, let's put aside 2,000 bottles, and then now we put aside 5,000 bottles of every vintage. I am very much into older wines. I don't need 40-year-old wines, but I like wines. I think that San Leonardo, after 10 years from the harvest, starts showing itself in a beautiful way. You know, it's not its peak, but it holds its youth with its fruity side and already shows its more savvious side of life. You know, I always represent it like a human being. I always say when it's 10 years old, San Leonardo, it's a bit like a gentleman of 30 years old or a beautiful woman of 30 years old. You know, you have your body is young, but you also have some wisdom already. You know, and that is a beautiful moment of San Leonardo. And so we keep a lot, and we sell out of our cellar from 2000 onwards for all the Michelin star or top restaurants. We just say Michelin star because it represents a category. And we keep a lot today, and I'm very fond of this, putting aside and leaving there to age.
If you have the ability to do it, it's absolutely an amazing thing to be able to do. Do you ever do library releases, or any plans to do any library releases?
Yes, indeed. For example, this year we should come out by Christmas time with the 2000s, which means from 2000 to 2008. Because then we jumped 2009 and 2002. So it's 8 bottles in one single case. We're going to have maybe 100 or 200 of those, but we still sell maybe some years we open the cellar and we sell 300 or 400 bottles of one vintage and we put it back on the market. You know, then we wait and we put another vintage the following year so that, people can still find some older vintages coming directly coming directly from San Leonardo, which is the important part.
Well, I mean, well, I'm gonna be looking out for the case just talked about. That's first. But B, just for everybody watching, just so you know, one of the reasons why Anselmo and I have been talking for the last few months is that I just completed an entire vertical of every vintage of San Leonardo that's going to be published on Vinous in the coming weeks. Eye-opening tasting. That's all I'm going to say for now. That's all I'm going to say for now. But what I will say is that
what an honor for me.
it was my, trust me, it was my honor. What I will also say, everybody, I started this whole conversation talking about that retailer that had introduced me to San Leonardo, and the two vintages that they sold me at the time is they sold me the 99 and the 2004. And I got to tell you that I have been working as slowly through those two cases as I possibly can over the last 10 years. Because, I mean, talk about two vintages, right? But I can tell you, it's every single time I open one of those bottles, it's like you know, an angel has died. You know, it's like one less angel in the sky. So it's really, really exciting to think about having such an amazing library of wines that you guys can pull from, and especially for the possibility for consumers to be able to get them.
Yeah, and we keep, you know, big, large formats and magnums. We do maybe 800 magnums a year we put aside, because I always believe, you know, a magnum is a magnum. I mean, Eric, you know this. I mean, it's just a bottle that is just speaks of its own. I mean, when you open a magnum, it's just phenomenal, I think, you know.
Yeah, no, I've made sure to collect quite a few magnums in my life. It's just I figure as I get older, I'll find a good parties to open them for. That's all it comes down to.
For sure, for sure.
So for you, when you first started getting involved, were you already into wine? Was it something? I mean, obviously, it's in your blood, it's your family, it's your home. But was it something you always
exactly? No, Eric, I must say the truth. You know, the first time I tried wine that I can recall, because this is something that somebody asked me recently, and I was really thinking about it, was on my first communion with the priest. And I thought it was the most disgusting thing I've ever tried. You know, he gave it out to me from the holy chalice, and I thought it was horrible. Then, obviously, around 15, 16 years old, I started drinking at home, you know, a glass of wine my father would pour. And I started appreciating more the white wines rather than the red wine. And then when I started working here, well, you know, San Leonardo represents freedom for me. Represents freedom and roots. This is the place where I spent my childhood summers with my father, which was working a lot here. I was living in Rome with my mother. And so when I would come here, you know, it would be time with my father, time on the tractors, time with the guys of the fields, which are still great. I mean, I'm a great fan of the countryside, really. And then the cellar, you know, you start working in the cellar during harvest time, and you fall in love. I mean, it's not something, I cannot say that I was passionate about wine from the minute I was born. You know, it's something that grew inside me. Mm-hmm. And I'm a producer of wine. I'm not a wine taster. And there is a difference. I've met this in my life. I mean, there are so many great tasters. I'm not an extraordinary palate, I would say, you know, but I'm definitely, I love San Leonardo to the death, and I understand about the plants, about this small universe, you know, and I feel that my mission is to protect this small universe, and the wine is the way to talk of the world from the love that not only my family has, but all the families who live on the estate have for this small piece of land, you know. It gives a sense of life to us. Mm-hmm. This is what San Leonardo represents to me.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. I have a couple of questions that I want to share with you from people that are viewing. First one comes from Jonathan, and he's well, first he's saying thank you for making such beautiful wines. And he's asking what your favorite vintage of San Leonardo is in the last 20 years. Your favorite vintage?
Last 20 years, there are two vintages that I must say drive me, make my heart beat. One is the 2000, because it's practically the first vintage that I got the permission to attend the tasting for the blending, because it was in 2002. And so that is really the first vintage of Carlo Ferrini, with whom I started working with in the States. So it represents to me an important vintage. which I hated at the beginning in terms of wine. I didn't like it. I thought it wasn't a great wine. And my father told me that is a great wine. You will see it will take decades, but it will be a great wine. And today I personally think it's a lovely vintage to drink. And then I love 2005 very much. It's a bizarre vintage of San Leonardo, if you want, but it is a vintage on which when I tried it at first, when I was younger, obviously in 2000, it must have been around 2007 when we blended it and we started making the San Leonardo. I thought it was wonderful. It represents maybe a step forward in my own experience of winemaking, being together with my father, Luigino, and Carlo Perini. So these are the two vintages that I hold preciously in my heart.
Oh, that's two great vintages to hold precious, that's for sure. The 2005 is a very pretty wine. I mean,
exactly. It's not maybe the best one, but it's very pretty, as you said. That is a word I personally appreciate very much.
And then Rob, so Rob, I can answer this for you. What we were saying is that the 2010 is the first time that Cabernet Franc was taken off of the label. They didn't make a wine in 2009, which means that 2008 would have been the last time that it was listed as Cabernet
exactly.
Franc. And then let me see here. So,
but in reality, it has only been Carmenere always. So
this is actually a really good question too. I'm sorry.
You will read on every menu Cabernet Franc, every wine list Cabernet Franc. Right. But be sure, I tell you, it's only Carmenere.
Right. No, absolutely. Since the beginning. And then a good question from Marcus. Actually, it's a great question because a lot of people are thinking about this right now. He's asking, with the current situation, is it possible to visit wineries and taste wines, or are you able to accept visitors?
Yes, we're fully open. We're fully open. Full wine tasting is on. You must reserve, so please go on the website. There is all the context and details. We do our wine tastings. They're nice. They last 2.5 hours. It's a beautiful promenade inside the estate because San Leonardo is not just winemaking. San Leonardo is still a property of a family, so it's still a house. We have our own vegetable garden inside of it. The gardens of my father, who is a great gardener, I must say. And so there is a museum. It's not just the wine and selling wine and making wine. The museum of my father is fascinating. So it's a nice visit, I would say.
Absolutely, man. And then this question brings up another point that we were talking about. So Sid is asking about having issues with frost in 2017, reducing the crop.
Oh yes.
Has this been a continued problem? Are you witnessing a lot of issues with global warming?
So we had let's talk 2017 was a horrifying year at the beginning and in the middle. So we did not have
frost. Like at the very end too for you.
No, yes, because you know, and I'm gonna say now we're gonna tell this story. We started with the frost. I remember 1st of May at 5 o'clock, we were already in the fields. The floor was cracking with ice, but the plants were not hurt. We lost maybe 10 plants in the whole estate. We were super lucky. Then it rained and rained and rained. And then finally we got, at the end of August, the sun. Finally, we saw this yellow thing that we had not seen for the whole year coming out. And we had September and October, an Indian summer, as you would say in the US. And we've made a fantastic wine. And then all of a sudden, about 2 weeks ago, we found a hole in the vat and we lost 25% of it. And this is the first time it happened in our career. We still have not found exactly the hole. We took out immediately the wine, we put back water, and we're making the water go slowly down to understand exactly where is the hole. We cannot find it. And it's something that, and it was pure luck that we found out, Eric, because the cellar master, Antonio, went downstairs, opened the vat, and he started screaming. I heard, "Oh my God, the wine!" And we went down to the cellar. We immediately pumped the wine in another vat. So, I mean, luckily we have insurance. It's life, you know. But 17 is going to be something very special and pretty. So
very limited vintage as well. So a 25% reduction of normal quantity. I mean, how many bottles?
And it was already a small vintage, you know. I mean, it was already a vintage around 60,000 bottles instead of 80,000. and we lost about 15,000 bottles. So,
Wow.
that's
How do
life.
you feel about the vintage itself? I mean, from what you've tasted so far, obviously it's still very young. It hasn't been
No,
bottled.
I tell you, global warming is affecting wines in general. We are working extremely well thanks to the pergola, as I told you. We do not do green harvest since 20 years, maybe even 25. I stand up while talking to you like that. We can go through the vines
Yeah,
and show you the
please.
mountains. We don't do any more green harvest anymore since 25 years to protect the fruits. And here you see them here; they're growing. So they're nice in this moment. And 2017 is a vintage which is already very smooth, and this is something unusual. In the past, the wines were very green at the beginning and took ages to ripen. Today, the wines are smoother. Maybe I say maybe, Eric, and I say it against my personal, I say, interest. Maybe these wines will last 35 years instead of 40, maybe, or maybe 30 instead of 40. But on the other side, you can enjoy them slightly earlier. But we are very happy because of having the pergola, which is right here. This is the most ancient vineyard of the estate. You can see it. It's called the Pergolone.
Amazing.
So it means the big pergola. And these are all plants of Carmenere, which are 80 years old, and
That is
they are
amazing.
beautiful sculptures. You can see just looking, from the bottom to the top. You see the sculpture of these beautiful plants. Thanks to older vines and the pergola, we reach to maintain the alcohol level low, and so to protect the wine as well. Because when you get an unbalanced wine, then it won't age well. Also the sugar part. If it's too much,
Right.
it's wonderful, but it doesn't age as well. This is our own experience in San Leonardo. Don't get me wrong. Then I cannot talk for in general because wine is such a complex a subject that that everybody knows its own place, and I know my place, and so what I would say that even in these last years we have made wonderful wines. You will be tasting 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. They're all beautiful, all 13% alcohol, very fresh, but on the other side, slightly more ready and smooth than the wines of the 90s, I would say.
Well, I mean, but also, I personally find that with San Leonardo, even in those warmer, drier vintages of the past, the wines perform so well. So if this is something of a new, a slightly new style that's forming because of global warming, I certainly don't think that you really have to worry too much, because if you're going to end up with more 1990s, and
Exactly,
2000s, and
exactly,
I mean, there's no
exactly.
harm in that.
I mean, and also 97, of which I
97.
was not a
Yeah.
fan. I was not a fan. I tell you, Eric, when it came out, they had a lot of success because 97, in Italy was a very successful vintage. I
Sure.
was not a fan at all. But today I find it a great wine. I think that warm vintages up here in the north,
Yeah.
in the mountains, can really give a plus. Absolutely.
No, I agree. I agree 100%. They're absolutely gorgeous. Well, let me just say that this has been such an amazing pleasure speaking with you today. I know you and I can keep on going. For you guys that were in here at the very beginning, first signed on, Anselmo's also a big foodie. He likes to cook, as I do as well. So
I
we
love that.
talk
I'm a
about
great
that.
fan of that.
But thank you for coming on board and joining us
It's
here
such a
today.
pleasure.
To everybody watching, if I can just, my parting words would be, if you have not tried San Leonardo, if maybe you've had one of those classic vintages that really does need a decade to come around, I can't tell you how much I believe that it is worthwhile for any collector, speculator, or lover of wine to try these wines. Because if you love old school Bordeaux, if you love the whole cool climate revolution when it comes to varieties that like for Cabernet in say even California, where producers are trying to find these cooler higher elevations, this is a producer and a wine you must try. It is a bucket list wine, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Eric. That is
Anselmo,
very
thank you so
kind.
much for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
Thank you. What a pleasure. I mean, what a
Enjoy your
pleasure,
beautiful
really.
Trentino.
Grazie.
Ciao,
Grazie
and thank
mille,
you.
and
You have a
come
good night.
soon to see us. Come soon to see us.
Certainly will. Bye, everybody.
Take care. Ciao, ciao, Eric. Grazie.